The Louisiana swamp was eerily silent, except for the distant croaking of frogs and the occasional splash of something unseen beneath the murky water. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. A pair of glowing eyes emerged from the darkness, followed by another and another. Alligators. Watching. Waiting. A black pickup truck rumbled to a stop at the water's edge, its tires sinking slightly into the mud. The driver's side door creaked open, and a tall man stepped out, adjusting his expensive felt hat. Elias Rathbone, a ruthless oil tycoon and illegal horse trader, took a long drag from his cigar before exhaling into the humid night air. He glanced toward the rusty trailer hitched to his truck, his expression void of sympathy. Inside that trailer, barely able to stand, was a mustang named Koda. His deep chestnut coat was smeared with dried blood and sweat, his ribs faintly visible beneath his once powerful frame. Captured in the wild and forced into brutal races for profit, Koda had refused to break, refused to bow, and for that he was now worthless to Elias. A wild horse with no purpose was just dead weight. Two men, Silas and Boone, yanked the trailer doors open, the metal groaning in protest. They grabbed Koda's rope and pulled, dragging the mustang toward the edge of the water. He resisted, hooves digging into the dirt, but the chains around his muzzle tightened painfully. Elias scoffed. "You had your chance, boy," he muttered, flicking ash from his cigar. With a rough shove, Silas and Boone forced Koda into the swamp. The water exploded around him. The ripples spread, and from the shadows, the alligators moved in. But then, something happened that no one expected. The cold swamp water closed around Koda's legs, sending a violent shiver through his battered body. His hooves sank into the soft mud beneath him, and for a moment his weakened limbs trembled, barely able to hold his own weight. The pain from his injuries screamed through his muscles, but the sharp hissing from the dark waters around him sent a far greater warning. The alligators were coming. A pair of glowing yellow eyes cut through the blackness of the swamp, followed by the slow, deliberate movement of a massive reptilian body. Then another. Then another. The creatures glided forward with chilling patience, their scaled backs barely breaking the surface, their powerful tails swishing silently beneath the water. They had smelled blood. They had seen prey. On the shore, Elias Rathbone smirked, arms crossed over his chest as he watched the mustang struggle. He had seen countless animals meet their end in this swamp, worthless racehorses, aging cattle, hunting dogs that no longer served their purpose. It was a simple philosophy: if you can't make me money, you're not worth feeding. "Dumb animal," Elias muttered, shaking his head as he took a slow drag from his cigar. But then, something changed. Koda lifted his head, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. His chest rose and fell in deep, controlled breaths, and for the first time since being thrown into the swamp, his wild instincts took over. He was not some broken-down racehorse. He was not a pet, nor a possession. He was a mustang, a survivor, a warrior, a creature of the untamed lands. And he would not die here. With a sudden, explosive movement, Koda reared up. His front hooves slammed into the water with force, sending a powerful wave rippling through the swamp. The nearest alligator, a monstrous beast nearly 12 feet long, hesitated. The mustang's unexpected defiance stunned the predators for a split second, just long enough for Koda to act. His instincts screamed at him, "Move." No. Ignoring the pain, he lunged forward, his muscles burning as he forced himself through the deepening water. The alligators, now fully engaged, lunged in response. A massive set of jaws snapped inches from Koda's flank, but the horse twisted at the last second, his hooves splashing wildly as he maneuvered through the swamp. On the shore, Elias narrowed his eyes. "No way," he whispered, his smirk vanishing. Silas and Boone exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen animals drown in this swamp. They had seen creatures torn apart within seconds. They had never seen one fight back like this. But Koda wasn't fighting just to survive. He was fighting to win. The swamp churned with chaos. Koda's powerful legs kicked against the murky water, sending ripples through the stillness that had once belonged to the alligators. He could hear their hissing all around him, the deep, guttural sounds of predators closing in. But he didn't freeze. He couldn't. His body ached, his wounds burned, but something inside him pushed forward. Instinct. The same instinct that had kept his ancestors running wild across the plains for centuries. Survival wasn't a choice, it was in his blood. The largest alligator made its move first. Its ridged tail flicked beneath the surface, propelling it toward the mustang with terrifying speed. Koda caught a flash of movement just before the beast lunged, its massive jaws opening wide, aiming for his legs. Koda reared up just in time. The alligator's teeth snapped shut on empty air, but the sudden movement sent Koda stumbling backward into deeper water. His heart pounded against his ribs. He was running out of time. From the shore, Elias Rathbone watched with a furrowed brow, the confidence in his smirk beginning to fade. He had expected the mustang to thrash for a few seconds, maybe let out a few desperate whinnies before the swamp took him under. But this was different. "Damn thing's got some fight in him," Elias muttered, taking a slow drag from his cigar. Silas, standing beside him, shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, what if he makes it?" Elias shot him a sharp glare. "He won't." But deep down, Elias wasn't so sure anymore. Back in the water, Koda had no time for doubt. Another alligator was coming, this one smaller but just as deadly, moving in from the side. With a deep breath, Koda did something unexpected. Instead of trying to flee, he charged. His hooves crashed down on the alligator's snout, and the reptile recoiled, momentarily stunned. Koda took the chance and surged forward, kicking up water as he powered through the swamp toward the nearest patch of land. The alligators weren't giving up, but neither was he. The shoreline was close now. He could see the muddy embankment, the tangled roots, the place where solid ground began again. His body screamed in exhaustion, but his mind focused on only one thing: getting out. With one final push, Koda lunged forward. His front hooves found purchase on the muddy shore, his back legs still kicking against the water. He felt the pull of something, teeth grazing against his hindquarters, a last-ditch effort from the swamp's hunters. Pain shot through him, but he didn't stop. With a desperate, powerful leap, Koda pulled himself free. He collapsed onto the shore, his body heaving, his legs trembling beneath him. But he was out. He was alive. And when he lifted his head to face the men who had left him for dead, they no longer looked so sure of themselves. Koda's legs trembled beneath him, his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Every muscle in his body screamed in agony, but he refused to fall. His deep chestnut coat was soaked, clinging to his body, streaked with mud, sweat, and blood. The fresh wound on his hindquarters stung from where an alligator's teeth had barely grazed him, but he had made it. He had escaped the jaws of death. And now, as he stood there, his ears flicking toward the men on the shore, a strange realization settled in. They had expected him to die. At the water's edge, the alligators lingered, their cold, reptilian eyes locked onto him. They hovered just beneath the surface, their powerful tails swishing lazily, waiting to see if he would stumble back into their domain. But Koda held his ground, his hooves sinking slightly into the damp soil. He was no longer just prey trying to survive. He was a fighter who had won. And the swamp had recognized it. Elias Rathbone stood rigid, his cigar forgotten between his fingers, the ember at its tip burning down to nothing. He had never seen an animal, especially one so beaten, so discarded, fight back like this. Koda should have been dead, swallowed whole by the swamp like so many others before him. But instead, he stood there, defiant, unbroken. Silas shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "Boss, what now?" His voice held an edge of unease. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The Mustang was supposed to disappear beneath the water, not climb back out. Not stand there, staring them down. Koda took a step forward. His body screamed in protest, his injuries weighing on him like chains, but he didn't stop. His dark eyes locked onto Elias, and in that instant, something shifted. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was something more. A challenge. A silent, unwavering message. You tried to kill me. You failed. For the first time in a long, long time, Elias felt something unfamiliar creep up his spine. Doubt. The air was heavy, thick with moisture and the lingering scent of stagnant swamp water. Koda stood tall, his chestnut coat slick with sweat, mud, and streaks of blood, his muscles trembling from exhaustion but refusing to give in. Every breath he took was sharp, controlled, his ribs rising and falling in steady defiance. He had been thrown into the jaws of death, expected to be nothing more than another forgotten carcass beneath the water's surface. But here he was, alive, unbroken, staring down the man who had tried to erase him. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Even the alligators, once ruthless in their pursuit, had begun to retreat, sensing that their hunt had failed. The swamp, which had been alive with movement moments ago, was now still, as if nature itself had paused to witness what was happening. And at the center of it all, Koda did not back down. Elias Rathbone's jaw tightened. His usual air of superiority, the smug confidence that had ruled his life for years, flickered. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had expected to watch the Mustang struggle for a few pitiful seconds before the swamp swallowed him whole. Instead, the damn horse stood before him, looking at him in a way no animal ever had before. Not with fear, not with submission, but with something much worse, defiance. With a frustrated sigh, Elias flicked his half-burned cigar into the mud. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath. He had spent his life believing that power meant control, that the strong dictated who lived and who perished. He had broken men, crushed businesses, discarded animals like trash. But this horse, this worthless, injured Mustang, had just shattered that illusion. Silas and Boone, his most trusted men, shifted uncomfortably at his side. They had been with Elias long enough to know his methods, to carry out his orders without question. And yet, as they stood there watching Koda, something about this felt different. The Mustang should have been dead. Instead, he had fought, survived, and now stood in front of them like he had won a war. Koda took another step forward. His legs screamed in protest, his body ached with every motion, but his spirit burned hotter than ever. He wasn't running. He wasn't pleading. He was making something very, very clear. They could beat him, wound him, throw him to the wild, but they would never, never, break him. And for the first time in his life, Elias Rathbone didn't know what to do. Koda stood his ground, his deep chestnut coat darkened by sweat, blood, and the filth of the swamp. His breathing was labored, but steady, his nostrils flaring as he took in the damp night air. Every muscle in his body was on fire, screaming for rest, but he refused to collapse. He couldn't. Not while the men who had sentenced him to death were still standing before him, watching him like he was something they couldn't explain, something they couldn't control. Elias Rathbone had spent a lifetime believing he was untouchable. Powerful men didn't answer to animals. But standing there, staring into the dark, unwavering eyes of the Mustang he had thrown away, something in him shifted. This was not a broken creature begging for mercy. This was something else. Something Elias didn't quite understand, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. A deep silence had fallen over the swamp. Even the insects, the distant croaking of frogs, the rustling of unseen creatures in the trees, all of it seemed to fade. The alligators had given up, their hulking bodies now drifting aimlessly through the murky waters, defeated. But the real battle wasn't in the swamp anymore. It was happening here, in the space between a man who thought he held all the power and a wild mustang who refused to be tamed. Silas cleared his throat, his boots shifting uneasily in the mud. "Boss, what do we do?" His voice was low, uncertain. Boone, usually the first to act without question, stayed silent, eyes flicking between Elias and the mustang like he, too, was beginning to doubt everything they had just witnessed. Elias didn't answer right away. He studied Koda for a long moment, taking in the horse's stance, the way he held his head high despite the pain, despite everything. There was something about that kind of defiance, that kind of spirit, that Elias recognized. It reminded him of himself, of who he had been once, before power had turned him into something cold and cruel. Finally, Elias exhaled, reaching into his coat pocket for another cigar. But when he pulled one out, he hesitated, turning it over between his fingers before shoving it back into his pocket. He looked at Koda one last time, then at Silas and Boone. "Leave him," Elias said, his voice quieter than usual. "He earned it." Silas blinked, as if he hadn't heard right. "What?" "I said leave him," Elias repeated, turning toward the truck. "We're done here." Without another word, he climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the darkness as the truck rumbled forward. Boone hesitated for a second longer before following, but Silas stood still, looking back at Koda. The mustang stared at him, unblinking. Not with fear, not with gratitude, just understanding. Then, just like that, they were gone. As the sound of the truck faded into the distance, Koda finally allowed himself to breathe. His legs trembled, his body exhausted beyond measure, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. He turned his head toward the swamp, toward the place where death had tried to claim him, and then back to the open land ahead. There was no one left to stop him now. With a slow, painful step, Koda walked forward, toward freedom. Koda's legs felt like lead as he moved forward, each step sending a fresh wave of pain through his battered body. The deep gashes along his flanks throbbed, his muscles burned, and exhaustion tugged at him like chains threatening to pull him down. But he refused to stop. The swamp had tried to claim him, men had tried to break him, but he was still standing. And now, there was only one thing left to do: keep going. The night stretched endlessly ahead, the thick Louisiana air clinging to his coat as he walked. His ears twitched, alert to every rustle in the underbrush, every distant hoot of an owl. Instinct told him to stay on guard. Though Elias and his men had left, he couldn't trust that the world wouldn't throw another challenge his way. It always did. As the swamp thinned out behind him, the land ahead opened into rolling fields, the kind of open space his ancestors had once run wild in. A mustang didn't belong in cages or trailers. He belonged here, where the wind carried his spirit and the earth welcomed his hooves. But Koda wasn't free yet. His injuries slowed him, and the scent of humans still lingered in the air. Somewhere nearby, there were ranches, roads, fences, barriers that could trap him again if he wasn't careful. Far in the distance, the soft glow of lights flickered against the horizon. A ranch, maybe. A barn. Safety, or another prison. Koda didn't know. But as much as he longed for the wild, he knew his body wouldn't last much longer without rest. His steps became sluggish, his vision blurred at the edges. If he didn't find shelter soon, he would collapse where he stood. As he crested a small hill, the scent of hay and horses filled his nostrils. A wooden fence stretched along the landscape, enclosing a pasture where a few horses grazed beneath the moonlight. Their ears perked at his presence, but they didn't flee. They recognized one of their own. Koda's legs buckled, and for a brief moment he fought against the darkness threatening to pull him under. But he had made it this far. He had survived. And just as his body finally gave in, collapsing onto the cool grass, the distant sound of a barn door creaking open reached his ears. Someone had seen him. Koda lay still, his chest rising and falling in slow, labored breaths. The cool grass beneath him was a relief against his fevered skin, but his body remained aching, exhausted, and raw from his wounds. His vision blurred in and out of focus, shadows shifting in the moonlight as he struggled to stay conscious. He had made it this far. He couldn't give up now. A soft creak broke the silence. A barn door opening. Footsteps followed, slow and careful, crunching against the gravel path. Koda's ears twitched. Every instinct told him to get up, to run, to disappear into the night before another human could try to claim him, break him, own him. But his legs wouldn't move. His body had given everything to survive the swamp, and now it demanded rest. Through the haze, he saw a figure approaching. A woman. Her silhouette was outlined against the barn lights, her long braid falling over one shoulder. In one hand, she held a lantern, its golden glow flickering in the breeze. Her movements were cautious but not afraid. She had seen him, but instead of rushing forward, she hesitated, studying him, reading the situation before making a move. She took another slow step closer. "Easy there, boy," she murmured, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had spent her life around horses. She wasn't a threat. Not yet. Koda flared his nostrils, catching her scent. Hay, leather, a faint trace of something sweet. It was familiar in a way that made his muscles unclench just slightly. But trust was not something he gave freely. Not anymore. The woman knelt a few feet away, placing the lantern on the ground between them. "You look like you've been through hell." Her voice was soft, but there was something in it that made Koda listen. Understanding. She wasn't just seeing a horse, she was seeing him. The other horses in the pasture stirred, watching from a distance, their tails flicking lazily. One of them, a tall gray mare, let out a low nicker. An invitation. A welcome. The woman slowly reached out a hand, palm open, letting Koda decide. Would he trust her? Would he let her help? Koda's body screamed for rest, for safety, for something other than the endless fight to survive. But deep inside, the fire still burned. He wasn't broken. And if this woman thought she could tame him, she was about to learn that he was unlike any horse she had ever known. Koda's breathing was slow and uneven, his body torn between exhaustion and the deep-rooted instinct to flee. He watched the woman carefully, his dark eyes filled with both wary defiance and raw exhaustion. The swamp had tried to take him. Men had tried to break him. Now, this stranger knelt before him, offering something he didn't recognize: gentleness. The night air was cool against his battered skin, the scent of hay and earth grounding him in a place that felt unfamiliar yet strangely safe. The woman remained still, her palm extended, allowing him to choose. There was no rope, no force, no demand, just quiet patience. It was the first time in a long time that a human hadn't tried to take something from him. Koda's ears flicked forward. The other horses in the pasture had settled, their soft snorts and the occasional flick of a tail the only signs of movement. The tall gray mare that had nickered before stepped closer, lowering her head to sniff at him before exhaling softly. A welcome. An acknowledgement. Koda remained stiff, but the presence of another horse soothed something deep inside him. He wasn't alone. The woman finally spoke again, her voice low and steady. "You don't have to fight anymore, boy." She shifted slightly but didn't get any closer. "You can rest now." Koda flared his nostrils, catching her scent again. Leather, sweat, earth, and something sweet. He had known humans who smelled like money, like smoke, like cruelty. She was different. Slowly, painfully, Koda moved. His muscles screamed in protest as he lifted his head just an inch higher, his ears still alert. This was a choice. His choice. And then, hesitantly, he did something that shocked even himself. He stretched his muzzle forward. Just enough for the tip of his nose to graze the woman's outstretched fingers. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't move, didn't push him. She simply let him come to her. And in that moment, something shifted. Koda wasn't surrendering. He wasn't giving in. He was allowing himself, for the first time in a long time, to feel something other than fear. But just as his body finally began to relax, a sudden noise shattered the stillness, the distant rumble of a truck engine. Koda's head snapped up, his ears swiveling toward the sound, his entire body tensing. Elias. The woman turned toward the noise, her brows knitting together. "What the hell?" she muttered under her breath. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, bouncing along the dirt road. Someone was coming. Koda's moment of peace was over. The low rumble of the truck sent a chill through the quiet night. Koda's body stiffened, his breath quickening as his worn, battered instincts screamed at him to run. He had barely survived once. He wouldn't let himself be trapped again. Not now. Not ever. The woman beside him straightened, turning toward the approaching vehicle. Her expression shifted from confusion to something sharper, determination. She wasn't just some rancher who had stumbled upon a lost horse. She understood what was at stake. The headlights cast long shadows across the pasture as the truck slowed to a crawl near the fence line. The door swung open with a creak, and Elias Rathbone stepped out. His boots crunched against the gravel, his movements slow, deliberate. He wasn't here by accident. He had come for Koda. "That's my horse," Elias said, his voice carrying that same arrogance, that same cold certainty that had condemned Koda before. The woman crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "Funny," she said flatly. "Doesn't look like yours to me." Elias let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Lady, you don't know what you're dealing with. That horse is worthless. Wild. Dangerous." His eyes flicked to Koda, narrowing slightly. "And I don't leave loose ends." Koda felt the weight of his stare, but this time, something was different. Before, Elias had looked at him like he was nothing, a piece of property, a mistake to be erased. Now, there was something else in his expression. Frustration. Uncertainty. Koda had survived everything Elias had thrown at him. And now he stood tall, strong, untamed. The woman took a slow step forward, her voice steady. "If he's so worthless, why are you here?" Elias's jaw tightened. He glanced at Koda one last time, his fingers twitching at his side as if debating whether this was a fight worth having. Then, with a sharp inhale, he made his choice. "Keep him," Elias muttered, turning back toward the truck. "He was never mine to begin with." Without another word, he climbed inside, slammed the door, and drove off, the taillights fading into the night. For a long moment, silence hung in the air. The woman exhaled, shaking her head slightly before turning back to Koda. "Well, boy, looks like you're staying." Koda didn't move, didn't flinch. He was free. Not because someone had given him permission, but because he had fought for it. The other horses in the pasture watched him, waiting. The open land stretched ahead, filled with possibilities. He could run. He could leave and never look back. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he had to. Slowly, Koda lowered his head and took a step toward the woman. Not as a prisoner. Not as something to be owned. But as a survivor who had finally found a place where he belonged.